So, my name is Alan Chlopek. I'm with Civic, Nebraska. I'm the Rural Civic Health Programs Manager, and I'm so excited for you to be joining us here today. We are joined by Charles Lieske of Mediation West, who will be talking to us about how we talk with our family members, our co-community members, how we talk about the topics we disagree on the most, some of those things that make the Thanksgiving conversations hard, some of those topics that maybe aren't the easiest to approach on a political level. I think the world right now is going through a lot of trouble with civil discourse, and I hope we all gain something from this. So a little brief overview of Civic Nebraska and kind of our work before we give Charles a chance to present here. But at Civic Nebraska, our mission is to create a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. We do that through three different pillars or three different sections: civic health, which is the team I am a part of, voting rights, and civic education. Through those three programs, we set out to accomplish that mission to create a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. Earlier this year, we released our Civic Health Index, which again states how we as Nebraskans relate to our state civically, as well as our states on the federal level. So it compares us to the other 49 states in the union and talks about how we stack up against them. One statistic I always like to throw out: Nebraskans, seventh most likely to volunteer. Also, or bottom 45 in actual donation amount. So very likely to donate our time, not very likely to donate our money. Um, so a little bit more on the Civic Health Index. That's broken down into four different sections: civic action, civic trust, civic access, and civic knowledge. As we go through these presentations, we'll be kind of focusing on a pillar for each one. But right now, I'll be transitioning the program over to our speaker, Charles. So thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'll get to sharing my screen here. All right. Hopefully you see some people joining hands and being together. So yes, thank you very much for joining me today and for inviting me to be here with you. I am excited to share some thoughts that I have about civil discourse and community engagement and the potential that I see to improve civic health here in Nebraska. At its heart, this is really about creating brave spaces where people can feel safe enough to share their views and experiences, even when they differ. And so we'll take a look here at our roadmap for today, where we're going to be going together. First, I'm going to highlight a few pieces of data from Nebraska's Civic Health Index that really stood out to me. And then I'm going to share how I view civil discourse, which is through that community mediation lens. And I'm also going to share some recent experiences that we've had here at Mediation West that really give me confidence that Nebraskans are ready for a deeper connection. We're also going to explore how civil discourse is different than positional arguments. And I'll help you think about how you can look at conversations that you're having in a new light. And then finally, I'll share some of the opportunities and challenges I see when bridging work between local, regional, and national organizations. And we do have some time for questions at the end. So I encourage you, if you have an aha moment or a question that comes up, go ahead and jot those down as we go along the way, and we'll have time to address those at the end. So why does civic health matter? Sometimes when we talk about civic health, we're kind of reducing that in our minds to voter turnout. And while that is one measure, democracy is really meant to be more than showing up at the ballot box, right? It's supposed to be more participatory. But in today's climate, people often avoid talking about their views. Sometimes that's out of fear of being misunderstood. Sometimes that's out of fear of being retaliated against. But here's the thing. Solutions to complex problems get better when we hear from more perspectives. And civic health has many moving parts, but at its core, it's really about how we show up for one another. So what is this value of connection, right? If civic health is about the strength of our connections with our neighbors. What's this all about? And I think Civic Nebraska has a very great way of looking at this, right? It's about strengthening the bonds between our neighbors. It's about replacing that trust that's been eroded away in a fast-paced, divided world. And for me, the why we want to do this really comes down to empathy. So much of our politics right now is built around making us fear the other side. And dehumanization is really dangerous. But if we have empathy, it lets us disagree while we're still learning from each other. And it's that learning that's going to help our communities innovate, preserve the good life, and face those challenges together that we have. So as Alan mentioned, in the chat, there is a link to the Civic Health Index. This QR code in the middle will also take you to the online version of that Civic Health Index. I encourage you to dig into the details of that when you have time. It's great information. It's very well organized. For today, I'm just going to walk you through a few of the pieces that really caught my attention. And so I'll start with civic trust. And there were a couple things in there that stood out to me. One, I think this data really shows how we deal with our neighbors. And while the data shows that Nebraskans interact with their neighbors more than average, we don't do quite as good a job of doing favors for our neighbors on a repeated basis. And when I think about my experience having lived both in urban and rural areas of Nebraska, I have seen that when a crisis happens, people come together across divides. It doesn't matter what it is that would normally divide you. When that flood happens, when that tornado comes, people are there and they are helping each other out, not thinking about those differences. But in our day-to-day lives, I really see Nebraskans as prizing that self-reliance. And sometimes we judge other people's struggles without considering the circumstances behind those. And that's where empathy can really help shift things for us. It can help us take that mindset that we have in those crisis moments where we're willing to just forgive and forget and dig in and help. And how can we bring more of that to everyday life? The other thing under civic trust that I think is really interesting, beyond how we deal with our neighbors, is I think those numbers show us how we deal with our democracy. So using rough numbers, about 60% of the people reported that they were voters, but only about 10 to 13% attended public meetings or contacted public officials. To me, that shows that in Nebraska, we equate civic engagement with voting alone. And civil discourse is really a way that I think people can flex that democratic muscle between elections and kind of learn how to step into this participatory democracy. The next box there is civic access. And Nebraska ranks 6th for participation in at least one community organization. But the other thing that was interesting in this data is that rural residents were dissatisfied with their cultural opportunities, like by a supermajority. And I think that matters because when we have those great cultural opportunities, it creates a pride in the community and it helps retain people in the community. And a lack of these opportunities are affecting our neighborhoods and our smaller communities. When it comes to the civic action tab, when you take a look at that, the way that I would tout civic action is it really looks at how people are sharing their time, their talent, or their treasure for the betterment of their community. So as Alan mentioned, in Nebraska, donations are down, volunteering is up. To me, this really signals that people want a personal connection. Sometimes, though, that personal interaction can have a negative effect. Civic action is sometimes misinterpreted as a critique of the community. And this can turn into something that feels like a personal attack. And so the dialogue process that Mediation West has been testing kind of accounts for that fear and finds ways to help frame improvement as an opportunity and not an indictment, which is really important for helping that have that healthy civic action there. The last area is civic knowledge. And the thing that stood out for me is news consumption is down for women and for middle-aged Nebraskans, and it's up for men and older Nebraskans. And that divergence matters, I think. So as I put this in terms of my personal experience, the women that I know who have stopped following the news cycles cite the divisiveness and the negativity. And the men I know often stick to one news source, reinforced by social media, which really allows for that confirmation bias and doesn't give the variety of opinion and a variety of thought process there. I think with both of these, both the decrease and increase in media consumption, those both highlight why dialogue across differences is so important, because it interrupts those echo chambers and it really builds empathy. So with that backdrop, I'm going to turn to history for just a moment here and talk about a shift in the media. So back in the mid-1990s, under the Clinton administration, there were a lot of regulatory changes that reshaped network news. And profit really began to take precedence over public service. Once information was driven by profit, fear and othering became profitable, especially through political advertising, right? So, in my view, that shift has had a lasting cost for our society and has contributed to part of where we are culturally today. But before we get too discouraged, it is worth remembering that we also have a very different history to draw from, one that points us towards connection rather than division. And for this, we're going to take a quick look and take a quick walk here through the history of mediation in our country. And I think you'll see why I believe civil discourse is not something new, but rather a return to our roots, because mediation in this country really finds its foundation in strengthening communities. So as we go through this slide, we see we start there in the 1880s. And the first real look that we have at community mediation being formalized is through the Federal Labor Board. It wasn't through the Department of Justice. And the thought process was, if you can resolve conflict at the earliest stage possible, and if you can resolve that conflict with the people who are closest to the conflict, you're going to get better results. And by putting this through the Federal Labor Board, the thought was, if people are happy at work, they're more productive. If people are productive at work, your communities are stronger, and it has a snowball effect for positivity. And so when they passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, this same attitude was taken in Section 10, where it calls on us to engage conflict at the earliest stage possible with the people closest to the conflict. In 1968, when Richard Nixon took office, being from California, he was very used to the county system of government. And so mediation was funded through the county system. And in the northern states, we saw that what I would call a true community mediation model was built, where it wasn't very formalized. It used a lot of volunteers. There weren't barriers to entrance, like you didn't have to have a certain degree or certain certification. You just hold space for your neighbors and help them through that conflict. In 1976, Jimmy Carter came to office, and his experience being from the southern states was very much that mediation should be an arm of the Department of Justice, and they shifted funding through that. And you saw mediation grow in the southern states, but it was a lot more formalized and was really running through that justice system. There were more barriers to entry. You had to have different kinds of training and that kind of thing. And so In the northern states, when that federal funding got cut off, if you had communities that were willing to fund or private donors that were willing to fund, those types of mediation programs continued, but they struggled a little bit while the ones in the South were building up. Well, then 1980 comes, Reagan gets elected, and there's a lot of funding cuts across a lot of areas, and mediation was one of those things that was defunded. And in Nebraska, we had kind of a resurgence of that community mediation through the farm crisis. We had very robust programs that were using volunteer mediators to try and save the family farm and really help people get those farm credit mediations taken care of. And so it was on that very positive backdrop that Senator Dave Landis, who served out of North Lincoln, introduced the Dispute Resolution Act in 1991, and that passed and is the basis for mediation in Nebraska. Since 1991, legislation has expanded mediation, making it an option in more and more types of files, and sometimes even being a requirement in more types of disputes. But I think the history shows us that when conflict is handled locally, communities really grow stronger. And that's the spirit that Mediation West has really been trying to reclaim. When I joined Mediation West in 2015, we were really heavily reliant on government contracts and government grants. We were operating in a very formal way, and we're almost quasi-governmental, but to some people we felt like an extension of the court. And pre-COVID, we made a conscious choice that we wanted to return to our roots of community mediation, meaning we're not just going to be in the community, but we're going to be of the community. And so we had a couple of experiences that really helped shape this shift for us. And one was a project we worked on to create a kit for school boards that were wanting to deal with their communities differently. And so we began this process by a deep dive with the administration, kind of figuring out where they were coming from, what they were wanting to get out of this process. And we found that we had really partnered with a school board and an administration that was a good fit for a project like this, because they were really willing to act on the feedback that they were going to receive from the community. The school district had a real hard time dealing with COVID. They talked about that struggle in terms of mask gate. That's the term that they did for that. And they realized that they did not handle those conversations well all of the time, that they didn't handle that conflict well all of the time, but they were future focused, and they wanted to make sure that when the next mask gate came along, that they were going to be able to handle that differently. And so we began by using tools from an organization called Living Room Conversations, and the QR code on your screen takes you to that Living Room Conversations website. It's an offshoot of Mediators Foundation, but it's not designed to be used exclusively by mediators. These are tools that just normal community members can use to have conversations. It's tools that you can use at the Thanksgiving table to have conversations. It helps you navigate those differences and have people participate in a way that they don't feel threatened. We also hosted listening sessions in the community, and we were very careful to try to put those listening sessions in places and at times where we thought it would be accessible to people, and especially to people who may not usually have their voice heard. Some of those went well, some of those had 0 people show up. And so we made some transitions and actually added tables at the parent-teacher conferences. We called it Cookies and Conversations, and we had representatives from the Mediation Center at each school building, and parents could fill out a written survey, they could have conversations, and then we were able to take that feedback to the school board. And they really, they showed they meant it when they said they were willing to work on that feedback. One of the things that happened is we were consistently hearing, as we were talking to people, that they didn't know where the school board meetings were, what they were going to talk about. They didn't know just how to access any of that information. And so immediately the school district redesigned their website, put a link on the front page on where to find the agenda, where to find the date and time for that. And eventually went as far as moving their meeting location to, they had been meeting in the city council chambers, and they moved to the foyer of the high school, which accommodated more people and it was more accessible for folks to be able to attend those meetings. And so that was a very good experience, and it showed us what changes can happen and happen quite quickly when you have that right foundation for those conversations. We also participated in a grant for rural empowerment. And this was a way of engaging with the community that I had not really tried before and found to be wildly successful, and is something that we're going to duplicate again, especially as we think about starting these civil discourse opportunities in the community. So with the Rural Empowerment Project, I began by creating a list of people from different areas of expertise in our community. So we had folks from education, from healthcare, from economic development, people with lived experience, and on and on. And I then had one-on-one conversations with people from that list. And I was making sure that we're hitting people from every category so that we were getting a diverse feedback there. When I had those one-on-one conversations, we would talk about things like what brought you to the community, what keeps you here, what's going right. And then I would transition to a conversation about what would it take to keep these positives going in our community? What's it going to take to keep that alive? And this was a really different approach for people too. They're used to people coming in and saying, yeah, here's a project we want to do. We want you on board, and acting more like a salesman. And in this case, we were having real meaningful conversations. And so people were intrigued, and we formed small groups out of those individual conversations and worked to identify the values that people in that group had, the values that the organizations they were associated with had. And from that point, we merged into a single large group that spent a lot of time working to align and rank the values that that group wanted to be built on. And it wasn't until we finished that whole process that we then started to transition into a discussion of what was it that we needed to tackle and what were the strategies that we were going to use. And I would say that is probably one of the things that had the biggest impact for us, because a lot of times people want to help their community by first identifying the problem, then identifying the strategy, and then bringing people together to work on that strategy for that problem. But when you bring people together based on those shared values, you have that ability to be nimble and see different opportunities that come up, see different opportunities for things to work on that arise. And for this particular group, our community task force, the original trajectory that we had was working on obtaining grants for housing to help with folks that just were having a hard time with affordable housing. Our percentage of folks that live at or below the poverty level out here is usually 3 or 4 points higher than the rest of the state. And so poverty is a real issue for us. As those grant opportunities weren't working out, the group was identifying other things that could be done along the way to help. And so the group developed a resource sheet that is now sent out with every disconnect notice with Scottsbluff City Utilities, so that people have an easier way to try and keep their lights on. The other thing that we've been working on that we're excited about is training for law enforcement. So beginning in January, we are going to have a community-led training that'll be required for all of our police department employees on different aspects of generational poverty that we feel will help them do their jobs better. So talking about things like communication styles of people that have grown up in generational poverty, and what circular story structure means, and what it means when people are interrupting and using large voices, like not interpreting that as disrespect, for example. And so we're really excited about that. And it is going to really benefit our community to have that going. If we had formed this group with the premise that housing was the most important problem and that the strategy to do that was a federal grant, we would still be nowhere, right? But because we formed on values and we're moving forward that way, we're able to do other things that aligned with the values of the group. So why does this matter? I would say in both projects, both the school board toolkit and the rural empowerment, starting with those shared values gave that work resilience and momentum that I just haven't seen with other strategies before. And I really feel like this has prepared us to create and hold space for broader civil discourse as just a natural extension of who we are as a community mediation setting. Now, in retrospect, one of the things that's interesting is that I see we were actually applying the basics of mediation that we usually use for small groups or couples, and we were applying this to the entire community. So in mediation, we talk about positions, issues, and interests. And a lot of times conversations that look like they're values conversations are really positional arguments in disguise. And I'm actually going to borrow a slide here from basic mediation training and show you a little bit about how this works. So if you use the word position to actually think through this, where somebody sits when they come to a conversation is pretty easy to figure out. What is it that they want? So if you have an example of a landlord and a tenant, and the tenant is not paying rent because the landlord has not made repairs, the landlord's going to come to you and say she needs to pay the rent. The tenant's going to come to you and say he needs to fix the things that are broken. As mediators, one of the things that we try to do is separate the people from the problem so that people aren't sitting there attacking each other, but they're actually standing together and working on the problem together. So an issue is very similar sometimes to a position, but it's a little bit of a reframing. So as a convener of these two, I would say something like, okay, so it sounds like today you want to talk about the issue of the rent and you want to talk about the issue of the repairs, right? Starting that process of taking them from being against each other to being with each other against the problem. By doing that, you're better able to figure out what the inner need is or what that underlying interest is. Why is this problem so important to you? So for the landlord, it may be that they have a mortgage on the property and they can't pay their bills without the rent. And so security might be that underlying need that's driving their position. For the tenant, the type of repair that's needed could be a safety issue, right? And so safety for their property or other family members that might live in the house. When they start having those conversations that are acknowledging those underlying interests, then they can get more creative with their solutions, right? It's not just, you pay the rent and hope I fix it, or, you fix it and you hope that I eventually pay the rent, right? It's finding out how do we get the security for you? How do we get the safety for you in a way that's creative? And it really lets the parties then brainstorm on what that could look like. So this is applicable to really tough issues. It's not just some of those ones that may seem easier. And I'll give you a couple of examples there. So one example that stood out to me going back to the mid-90s was marriage. We had the Defense of Marriage Act that was being worked on. And I was watching a news program one time, and there was a guest from a religious community and a guest from LGBTQ community. And early in the conversation, the person from the religious community said, well, we owned the word marriage first, which sparked a lot of back and forth for the 3 or 4 minutes of that segment about you can't own a word, we can own a word, and having this very positional argument. There was a huge missed opportunity there by the news commentator that was helping folks guide that discussion in looking at the underlying interest, right? So if the person from the religious community had had the opportunity to say something along the lines of, well, the word marriage is important to me because it signifies a three-way covenant between a man, a woman, and God. When you start to fiddle with that, I feel like you're attacking my religion, my right to believe what I want to believe. The person that was from the LGBTQ community could have shared underlying values that might have been something like, well, when you use the word marriage to describe my relationship, you're creating an equality for me that I can't get any other way. Calling it a civil union doesn't give me that same equality, and that's why that word's really important to me. They're not going to necessarily leave that interaction changing their views and maybe not even necessarily agreeing with the other person. But the empathy that you start to build when you understand the why that heated argument happened for 4 minutes over a word, would have been much more valuable than the 4 minute argument over that word. I think another example that we see in modern times here that tends to stay on the surface more and not really get down to those underlying interests are transgender students in public schools, right? So there's lots of different facets that this can look like: use of the bathroom, being on sports teams, being called a name other than what's on a birth certificate, right? Um, this is an example that I think aligns so perfectly on what the underlying interests are, because at the end of the day, a parent of a transgender student wants that student to have the best opportunity that they can in their public education. And when you look at the parents of the cisgen student, they want their student to have the very best opportunity they can in a public education. So taking the time to unpack that and dig deeper can really help take us away from those positional arguments. When we take the time to ask why somebody is holding their position and we uncover those interests, it's often going to connect us to values we share. They're not always going to align so perfectly as the transgender student example, but as with um, the marriage example, there were different reasons that word was important, but which you could come together and understand that. Another example that I will share is the abortion talks, which was later retitled the Basement Talks. It's a full-length documentary, and it chronicles 6 women, 3 who were pro-life, 3 were pro-choice, and they had 2 facilitators who helped them meet secretly for 6 years. They started meeting together after the 1994 Boston Clinic shootings, and through all of their time together, these folks never changed their core beliefs, but they were able to build lasting relationships. They collaborated across divides. They prevented further violence in their community. And the thing that I love about this group when they tell their story is that at their very first meeting, they spent nearly 6 hours just trying to agree on the term for the result of the pregnancy. Eventually, they landed on human fetus, and it was a compromise that didn't really fully satisfy everyone. But in working through that language and struggling with the limits of language that they had, they really uncovered why those words mattered so deeply. And the process of listening to the why a certain term carried meaning opened up the door for real understanding. So next, I want to talk a little bit here about what the bridge can look like between our national and regional organizations and local folks that are working on these issues. And during the same time period that we were working on the school board toolkit and the rural empowerment project, I've also been a part of national conversations with different organizations. And NAFCM, the National Association for Community Mediation, has a really great system set up that I think is a great model others could learn from. And that is, as a national organization, they really see themselves there to support these community conversations, and um, allow people to do what's right for their community, right? They don't put in place a structure that you have to follow this structure exactly. They have 9 hallmarks that they say represent the best opportunity for success for folks that are wanting to do this kind of work. Um, and people strive to do that, but you really can be innovative for your community. They have resources. They've got a library that people have access to when they're members. They have different webinars that they put on. They make connections for people to have those conversations. And so I think they're a great model for what those partnerships could look like. Some of the other partners that I've collaborated with and worked with, the Trust Network is set up really to monitor uh, political violence and things that are happening in this country, and helping to watch for things like misinformation that might be out there on the internet. Bridging Divides is a Princeton project, and very much looking to provide different types of resources, training for people who might be interveners in community conflict. Divided Community Project is a group out of the Law College at the Ohio State University there. Again, those 3 organizations, in my view, the way that I see them, are very much um, focused on collaborating with different organizations. I think they've got um, specific views on how they think processes should work, but they're all adding very valuable content to what's going on there. Better Together America is a newer group that's formed out of Mediators Association. They are, um, I think, working really hard to balance providing the um, balance of structure and the community collaboration that builds up um, what they're calling civic hubs for people to have space for these types of conversations. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how that works. I think in a lot of ways, they align with the work that community mediation centers are doing. And I see some overlap there and some potential for some really good partnerships in the future. And then I put living room conversations on the slide again there to remind us that even without the structure of an organization, citizens have the access to things that will help them, that structure that will help them have those meaningful conversations with people at the family level, at the community level, within your own organizations. As I think about bridging the regional and the local, I think the biggest challenge that I see is, in general, national and regional organizations are still often leading with strategy. They've identified a problem. They've identified a way that they see will help really address that problem, and they're leading with that. Local organizations are making that shift to lead with values, and really using those values to create that community trust. And so I really think that both sides need each other. I think nationals and regionals have resources. Locals have built that trust. And I think that bridge between us is going to be better built if we take the time as individuals to assess our personal values, if we take the time as organizations to assess those organizational values, and if we really are doing the work to discover the community values, then we're able to find alignment between the 3, and it's going to make things go more smoothly. There's going to be trust more easily, and there's going to be that ability to kind of go with the flow as things come up. So why would we expand civil discourse? Why should we be looking at this nationally, regionally, and locally? Two heads are better than one. We've heard that since we were little kids. And as I mentioned earlier, complex problems need complex solutions. And you're not going to understand the complexities if you don't understand people's lived experience that's different than your own. I think it's really a great benefit to know that we can disagree with other people without being enemies. And it's okay that people think differently than I do. It's okay that they make different choices than I do. It's okay that they live differently than I do. We can still be neighbors and support each other, still see each other as human beings, not as objects. I really do believe we learn the most from people that don't think the same way we do, that have different lived experiences than we do. And that is the key to humanization and empathy. And those are the antidotes to division. So that's something I'm really passionate about. So I would issue an invitation to everybody on the call or everybody watching the recording to think about ways that you can take advantage of what I think the Civic Health Index is showing us as fertile soil, to expand that civil discourse in Nebraska, in your families, in your organizations, in your communities. If you're wanting to tackle something a little bit bigger and get into that community conversation, every county is served by a mediation center. I would say each one of us is at a different stage of community engagement. And we're at different stages of getting back to those roots of community mediation. We are still, as a network, still very dependent on government funding and government contracts, but we're making that shift to the community. And so I'm very confident that if you contacted your local center and said, I'd like to help with community dialogue, and I want that to happen here, I'm really certain that they would find a way to put your energy to work. This really is work that we can do all together, and excited for what the future holds, what Nebraska can lift up for the rest of the country in terms of how to get along. And with that, we've left a little bit of time for some questions before Alan kind of walks us through maybe some of how you can contribute through Civic Nebraska as an organization.
Yeah. So if there's any questions for Charles, now would be a great point. But I just want to say thank you so much for the great presentation today, Charles. It was great to learn so much about the history of mediation in the United States.
I love sharing it.
I did have one question. You said you
Yeah.
had some experience in the rural and urban side of civil discourse in your experience in Nebraska. Do you have any noticeable different ways we can start to cross that divide?
One of the things that I have noticed the most is when I lived in urban areas, the natural curiosity that people had brought them to the table more easily. In the rural areas, because we're smaller and people, maybe you don't know the individual, but you know of the family and you already have an opinion of the family, that natural curiosity isn't there as much. People have already drawn a conclusion about what somebody thinks or why they did a certain thing. And that is a little bit of a hindrance to the conversation. Natural curiosity drives your ability to really dig deeper with people. And when that curiosity is lacking, it's more work for the facilitator to dig into that.
That's a very good point. One question we just got in the chat was, how did you get into this line of work, Charles?
All right. Well, um, I was first exposed to mediation back in college. I went to Wesleyan, graduated in '95, and had a class there in mediation. Didn't really do anything with it though. It always was in the back of my mind and an interest to me. But in 2009, Lancaster County had an incident where there were some teens who had vandalized a church, the First Mennonite Church up on like 70th and Holdridge area. And the church leaders wanted to do something different than traditional retributive justice. And so they worked with the county and the mediation center there to say, what can we do to do something more restorative? And from that effort, they developed resurrected a juvenile victim offender program that over the years had kind of sat dormant. I was recruited in to be one of the first people trained in that program, and being reminded of mediation and the things I love about it. Started taking all the trainings I could in different areas of specialty, different case types, and volunteered with the Mediation Center out of Lincoln there. Um, and then in 2015, when the position for Mediation West opened up, because I was a executive director of a chamber of commerce, I had that nonprofit experience, but I also understood the mediation world. And so they recruited me to come out here. And, you know, those first couple of years, I really just kind of went with the flow, and we were doing our thing based on the contracts and the grants. And we sent someone, one of my staff members, to a philanthropy training that the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands put on, and introduced us to this idea of friend raising before fundraising. And that put us on track to think about how we could do things differently, how we could interact with the community differently, and put us on track with NAFCM and some of those other community mediation based things, and have allowed us to try some of the strategies that I've talked about today. And just being contacted by people from national groups that have seen what we're doing and we're interested in that. Nebraska actually is very well respected across the country in terms of what we have for mediation, in terms of what we've achieved politically with a one house legislature, with a public owned utility. Like, these are the things that people are like, you're this massively conservative state, but you're doing things that are so based in the people. And so
We have
we're
such
kind of a
a
novelty, and people want to know more about Nebraska.
we have such a rich history of doing what works and being pragmatic about what works in Nebraska. I'm so glad to hear that. You've already kind of touched on this a little bit, but Daniel had a question about how do we engage our local county mediator in community or civic issues? Do you think someone would be willing to help with some of these shared values discussions?
Yes, definitely. I think that holding that space for people to discover that would be really exciting for mediators in the different communities to do. I know that's one of the things that feeds me and energizes me when I help people have those aha moments, and like, that's why that's so important to me. That's why I'm holding on to this so tightly. And um, I don't get discouraged when I ask them, well, why do you want that? And they're like, I don't know. I just want it. Oh, okay. Well, there's probably something in it. Let's keep going and see what we can figure out.
Well, it just kind of gives you the importance of having that shared language and vocabulary.
Yeah,
All
definitely
right.
so. And
If there's
you had
no,
mentioned earlier the conversations you have over the dining room table and those type of things. I will say that going through the basic mediation training, one of the things that was huge for me was how I heard my wife differently, how I heard my family members differently, how I communicated back to them differently. Like, it made a fundamental shift in my personal communication, and more than just sitting as a mediator in a room with people. And so if people can learn these skills, it really does help your interpersonal relationships. It helps how you interact at work, as well as helping us build community.
yeah, that's so great and so true. Again, having that shared language and respect for one another goes a long way towards meeting in the middle.
Yeah.
All right. One last round, one last call for questions. If you've got a mediation you need it handled quick. We got a couple seconds here.
But I do see Heidi saying she's motivated to sign up to be a trained mediator. The next basic mediation training will be in Lincoln the first week in October. If you go to nebraskamediation.org, they'll have details on that. And I'm actually one of the trainers for that one. So if you sign up, you'll get to spend more time with me.
You two would be a great combination. We might solve a lot of Nebraska's problems at once if we put you two in the same room.
Awesome.
But just want to thank you all for being here again, and thank you, Charles, for your time today. We appreciate the effort people are putting forward to learn more about civil discourse and the Civic Health Index. Nebraska isn't going to fix itself as far as our problems. I think we've talked about that a lot today. We have to work together to find that common solution, to find that common language, to find those common goals. So if you want to read more about that, again, this is all in support of the Civic Health Index we released earlier this year. And it goes over those four civic pillars: that's civic action, civic trust, civic access, and civic knowledge. Um, uh, Real briefly here, I'll give you a couple different ways that you can engage in some of those um, activity building or strength finding uh, ways to keep recruited in Civic Nebraska. One of those ways is with the Idea of America Fellowship. I'm happy to say that one of our fellows is actually here. I won't go ahead and name her out loud, but thank you for being here. The Idea of America Fellowship is a nonpartisan leadership experience where we take a group of 6 to 12 community leaders through a retreat and guided discussion experience where we talk about the important founding documents of the United States, as well as what the founding fathers were kind of going through as the United States was, shaping out who it was going to be. So right now, that third cohort is recruiting for Central Nebraska and will be kicking off September 6th. If you know of anybody in the Tri-Cities area, we are always looking for more. Nebraska needs good leaders, and this is a great leadership development program. Another upcoming opportunity is with the apiary. This was just recently announced. It is another fellowship style program. This is more on civic engagement and working together to fight or to combat a local issue, more on the local impact level than on the leadership side, but also another way to interact with your community and keep developing those community building skills. For the younger folks amongst us, we have Kid Governor. That is an opportunity for fifth graders all across Nebraska to actually run a campaign and run for the chance to become the Kid Governor of Nebraska. That election will coincide with our state election. It'll, I believe, get cut down to 7 finalists, with one governor being elected and the other 6 members serving as that governor's board. So if you have a fifth grader or know of an elementary teacher who would be interested, please share that information. And finally, if you've got anything community conversation wise, that we could help with, Lily and I are the civic health program managers, and we're here to help you, whether that be, having the issues of civil discourse, civil access, how do you talk to the neighbor? How do you talk about disinformation or misinformation? We are happy to help you and have some conversations. So please reach out. I will also share that this again is the first of a series of webinars, all on the Civic Health Index. Our next guest will be Dr. L.J. McElday of the Nebraska Rural Poll, and he will be sharing some exciting new rural poll information with us. Rural Poll is it's Civic Health Index related. They do their own research and guidelines, but it really brings out a lot of how the less urban side of the state feels, and really enlightens us. Like Charles said earlier, not a lot of rural folks are satisfied with their cultural opportunities, and that can lead to dissatisfaction in a lot of other areas. So um, I would encourage you to sign up for that webinar. We'll be reaching out with the link for that in an email. So thank you all for your time today. If there's no other conversations, appreciate it.